the left has a human rights-focused perspective. I would be more sympathetic to that perspective if I thought it was effective. It's both ineffective for the UK and the US, and it's ineffective for African countries and their citizens. The rise in conflict across the continent has been stark. Development doesn't solve the security problems, and representation certainly doesn't solve the security problems. So this development/human rights framing has been unbelievably ineffective.
I'm Jason Pack, and this is Disorder, a show where we try to search for a semblance of order in our mad, 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 mad world. Amidst all the disorder around us, we search beyond the headlines for those key interconnections among seemingly disparate topics like climate change, tax havens, neopopulism, and the various conflict zones throughout the world. What are those connections? Well, in 2024, we looked a lot at Ukraine, Syria, Israel-Palestine, India, Bangladesh, and even North Africa. But we fell into the same trap of most mainstream newspapers. We didn't devote sufficient time to sub-Saharan Africa. So today, we're going to try to rectify that. We're going to look at Africa in the age of disorder. Africa in a disordered world is a very complex topic, and we're going to need to bring some real expertise to bear on it to treat it adequately. Hence, I'm bringing in the heavy hitters. We're going to draw on the geopolitical cavalry here. Therefore, I am very pleased to announce that the Disorder Podcast has just begun a new partnership which will last all of 2025 with, drumroll please, dun 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 dun, the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI. And RUSI is the world's oldest think tank and the think tank of the defense establishment in the United Kingdom. Our partnership with RUSI will entail monthly disorder episodes featuring RUSI's deep deck of experts in the security and defense sector. We will also have quarterly live events in Whitehall at RUSI's physical base. And those events will be available only to RUSI members and listeners who subscribe to the Ordering the Disorder Substack as paid members. So if you want to come to our March 11th Whitehall Jamboree, you've got to pony up and become a paid member of the Ordering the Disorder Substack. Now, RUSI has deep expertise across the Middle East and Africa, particularly relating to conflict, security, and peace operations in sub-Saharan Africa, with a specific focus on countering terrorism and violent extremism, combating illegal wildlife trade, environmental crime, and climate security. In fact, two of RUSI's recent outputs have looked at whether the Wagner Group served Russian foreign policy aims or might have actually harmed them, and if Sudan's conflict has reached a turning point or not. We're going to feature links to both of those outputs in the show notes, as well as more information about RUSI and our partnership. Drawing on RUSI's deep expertise, I now feel bolstered to tackle today's episode's topic, Africa in the Age of Disorder. I am excited to be joined by an acclaimed global leader in monitoring armed conflict in Africa, Professor Clionadh Raleigh. Cliona created Armed Conflict Location and Event Data, ACLED, which is a US-based NGO. She's also a professor of political violence and geography in the School of Global Studies at the University of Sussex in the UK. Cliona's areas of expertise include African political environments and elite networks, and she has largely concentrated on subnational power dynamics and their influence on violent movements. Welcome to Disorder, Cliona.
Thank you very, very much, Jason. It's a real pleasure to be here. And apologies for my voice. It is a post-Christmas cold. But nonetheless, I'm excited to be here.
I think it is a very elegant and Celtic warmth that is going to dispel us. You know, it's snowing here, but the Celtic warmth of the voice will come through. Cliona, you have more than 2 decades of experience of looking at conflict zones in Africa and around the world. How did you get into this, and how would you say that monitoring violent incidences and using computer tools and geospatial location helps us understand what's going on in the world around us?
So I started it because I was writing my PhD and I needed data to answer the question I had, which was, why do local conflicts look different from each other? If we followed the kind of typical ways of understanding violence, they should almost all be homogenous because they were responding to the same relatively static factors. And once I started doing that, it was really clear to me that as conflict scholars, we had narrowly focused on a type of violence that was really only one amongst a real variety of political violence that occurred not just in African states, but more broadly. So, we had missed communal violence, we had totally ignored gang violence, we didn't think about mob violence or militia violence. And instead, we focused on traditional established rebel groups, of which there are very few within Africa and across the world. And far more are much more flexible to different opportunities. Groups take advantage of different political circumstances in order to shape their conflict to be the most successful possible. So they don't start out by saying, I'm going to be a rebel group. They start out by saying, how much violence is needed for this goal and whether or not they can actually achieve it. And then they move from there.
Fascinating. So rebel movements throughout Africa and the world might start as gangs, or in the Libyan case, they might start as fuel smuggling operations, or they might start as a rogue general trying to expropriate some state resources, but then they use more and more violence because the forces of order either don't tamp down on them, or that violence is needed to get certain bits of the population on their side or to achieve their aims. That's compelling for me. Over the course of these 2 decades that you've been working in this field, how would you say that civil wars have changed, or conflicts have changed, because they might not be full-blown civil wars, in Africa as American hegemony has waned globally?
We have to stop thinking about conflict as a breakdown, because it's not, right? It's a function of these new orders. And an awful lot of groups can take advantage of this tool in order to establish themselves within the new order. Over the last 2 decades, what we've seen is a massive decrease in the number of rebel groups and a massive increase in the number of militias. And so rebel groups want to effectively force national change. They often want to either replace the government or establish a new government. That's kind of a classic way of defining what they do. They have a national campaign. What we found, of course, is that as African governments became more representative and more inclusive, there was really no justifiable reason to have a national campaign to overtake the government, because there were so many different ways that especially those who would have begun a rebel group could establish themselves as power holders within the system. However, violence was still extremely useful to those entities and others through militias. So what we find is local militias, regional militias, party militias, urban militias, some of which might become paramilitary groups, some of which might, of course, start to coalesce into different organizations. So, in Congo at the moment, the M23 movement has gone effectively as an aggregator of lots of local militias at different points to a consolidated, coordinated group. But when it breaks apart, they break into, again, lots of local militias pursuing different agendas.
All your study of militias and their evolution and how they break apart and fuse, what insights has that given you about the rise of neopopulism, such as the MAGA movement in the United States, or Reform in the UK, or Orban in Hungary?
So what I would say is that the militias that we're seeing here are not ideological. They're almost like hired. They're on retainer, often for political elites, who hire them for various tasks, especially within West Africa. We're seeing this dynamic a lot. They're hired for tasks such as harass this population who wants to vote for my opponent, or make sure these people don't get to the polls, or clear out that village because I'm having a dispute with somebody in the capital around something, and that's his support base, things like that. And so what I would say is that that whole kind of market for violence is much more developed within an African context than it is within the new right or the populist right within the US and Europe. And what I say is that there's a perception I have about polarization in both the UK and the US that it's almost a form of entertainment now. It's an identity rather than being some sort of an organizing principle. And there's very, very few opportunities for groups to become violent, both in the US and the UK. We're taping this on January 6th, and there was, 4 years ago, there was a massive problem with these groups coming together, coalescing rather than being coordinated. And I think that the work of the US security sector in the past 4 years to dismantle ways in which those groups would be able to coalesce again has been formidable. And I think that it shows you what is necessary in order to prevent these kind of local groups from emerging.
I like how you're not all doom and gloom, and it's really important to point out to the listeners ways in which our societies actually do function. But I wanted to point out a different analogy between militia recruitment in places in Africa and developments in neopopulism in our societies, which is that you can spread disinformation about an opponent and say they're bad, they're doing sex trafficking, they're in league with our enemies, they have corrupt financing, to then justify some kind of attack or taking the narrative away from them. And we've seen those tactics in war zones, and I think that we are seeing them more in our own societies where opponents, whoever is in power, or opponents of a given group are stigmatized, and then it's easier to dehumanize your attack on them.
Oh, I agree. I mean, I worry a lot about mob violence within our context. It's the type of violence we're seeing within places like South Africa. You don't see tremendous numbers of militias in South Africa. What you see is mob violence being generated from misinformation, disinformation, and there's certainly the possibility of that. I think that the organization of a group is extremely important to consider, and how well coordinated they are is important to consider. And mob violence is by definition kind of poorly coordinated. And I think that what we don't have within the US and the European context is often somebody willing to say, I will coordinate these groups, in my name or around these ideologies in a way that can keep them recruited, supplied, supported, legitimized. We don't have that. In fact, here in Britain, you have a figure named Tommy Robinson who is regularly finding himself in jail by using violent rhetoric. And, long may that continue, because it's an important check on a society going through a populist moment, and there not being a lot of opportunities to coalesce around violence.
Great. So if you were to create your own militia, would it be a police force keeping order, and how would it function? What are the lessons that you've learned here?
I would love to organize a coup. I think that that's really where my skills lie. But I would need some militia to do it, like as in some support. But it's a little bit like a scorpion tail. If you have a militia, you will eventually be stung by it. So I want to keep them small enough so that I'm brought in as a specialist, organize my coup, and then you can go home. And that would be fine.
What if we got some academics in North London together and you could have a multilingual militia? You'd only take PhD students. What would you utilize them to accomplish?
I mean, I love PhD students, but that's a surefire way to not get something done on time. There's deadlines involved in coups, Jason. Hence, we cannot have PhD students.
Excellent. So, joking aside, let us look at the state of Africa, civil conflict in Africa, militia violence in Africa. But I'd like to begin with the question of American policy towards Africa over the last decade. I think that President Biden has actually made some underheralded but quite signature achievements in Africa policy. Is that right?
To some degree, certainly. I mean, there's been more engagement with Africa than I would say, of course, the first Trump administration had engaged in, and potentially, of course, the end of the Obama administration. But it was from a low bar, I guess, that I would say that Biden has improved upon rather than a really robust relationship. I think the most meaningful engagement that the U.S. has across African states is through USAID and the State Department, of course. But what I would say is that USAID can sometimes present itself as being at the forefront of political engineering across African states. And African leaders have really, in the last decade, taken a pretty negative interpretation or negative view of that political engineering. And so it's been a rocky relationship, despite the improvements.
Okay, so you explain a situation where American policy towards Africa was starting from a low bar. Biden has tried some initiatives, but there is a skepticism among African leaders that Western aid programs are actually, to their benefit. Let's look forward towards the Trump term. What are the implications of Trump's policies, particularly his tariffs, towards issues of stability and security in Africa?
Well, I was just reading today that we should actually expect quite positive economic news out of many African states in 2025. They have escaped some of the worst predictions in 2024, and so the growth is there to be had across several countries. The tariffs are less of an issue within African states, in part just because of the very low level of trade between various African countries and the US. What is more important to consider is that the BRICS, and of course, in particular, China, are looking to African states to supply them with agricultural trades, and I think, of course, precious minerals and many other commodities that they have a very robust trading relationship with. Any sort of tariffs on the side of the US is just going to further entrench and bring those two entities closer together rather than making more room for new relationships with those leaders.
Well, one of the implications of a disordered world is everyone's policies are pulling in different directions. So China pulls this way, Africa pulls this way. The EU doesn't necessarily work with America perfectly. They do something slightly different. And that degree of lack of coordination is only set to increase, right?
Yeah, I would agree with that wholeheartedly. What I would also say is that the Trump administration and Trump himself, and potentially even Biden, to be totally frank, have an understanding of Africa that I think is quite dated. They look at it as an aid recipient rather than a trading partner or a viable or useful member of the emerging middle powers and the BRICS group. And as a result, they have missed out on several opportunities to create leverage and to create new terms of agreements with what are rising powers, whether it is South Africa or Ethiopia or Nigeria. These are, within their own right, powerhouses within the continent, but also within the global South and increasingly within middle powers.
I'd like to underline that point, Cliona, because I think that this is critical. One of the key features of the enduring disorder is that middle powers, and I'm talking states like Turkey, for example, but then maybe also India, are increasingly powerful in their near abroads regionally. Because if we go back to the Cold War, there was no region unimportant enough for the Soviet Union and America to contest and try to order and dominate. And middle powers were important, but not critical in setting the regional tone. Then we had the hyperpower moment of America with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And now we're in a new era, this enduring disorder. And obviously in the Middle Eastern region, Turkey and Iran and Israel, they're the ones setting the conflict dynamics. They're the ones setting the regional tone. So let's apply that to Africa, as you have excellently laid out. The Nigerian economy has really grown tremendously in the last 2 decades. And I don't know much about Ethiopia, but it's gone through a civil war, the Tigrayan civil war. Could you sketch for us the top-line developments in each of those states and what they are attempting to do in their near abroads and also in their global policies?
So in Nigeria, I'll start there. There is an election in February of 2023 where Bola Tinubu won. It was a little bit like an incumbency. And he since has gone and developed a quite significant raft of economic measures. Those have not gone off particularly well, in part because the biggest issue with Nigeria is to deal with its own corruption, especially local corruption and national corruption. And that was not dealt with despite how bold those economic changes were. So those have a way to go to be successful, but they were also designed to deal with the energy wealth and making sure that Nigeria could make best use of its resources. And Nigeria has significant internal problems outside of its own economic problems. It, of course, is surrounded by very, very successful Islamist jihadi movements. And of course, they have many homegrown. And so Nigeria's attempt is to effectively take its size, its sheer size in terms of both demography and their economic size, and being able to really set the agenda within West Africa. That's being curtailed, of course, because of the threats to it and the threats that it in fact generates through its own corruption. So Nigeria is not part of the BRICS, in part because of these types of internal instability.
Thank you for sketching that out. That shows how disorder works. If you're in a disorderly neighborhood, you suck disorder into yourself. And if you have internal dysfunction, say corruption or the inability to grow the economy properly or domestic unrest, you export disorder around you. And so Nigeria's internal disorder makes it difficult to deal with Islamist movements that are around it. And we can certainly grasp how that mirrors global developments. Well, enough on Nigeria. Shall we turn our lens to Ethiopia?
Sure. One of my favorite subjects. So in Ethiopia, we're 2 years into the Pretoria Peace Agreement, which ended the war between the Northern Tigray People's Liberation Front, or the TPLF, and the Ethiopian government led by Ahmed Abiy. And that war was incredibly brutal. The TPLF lost, and the Ethiopian government kind of barely won it with significant assistance from Turkey. As soon as that war ended, a few things happened, which is that the conflict in the Oromo region between the Oromo Liberation Front, or sometimes called Shane, and the government continued, and it was actually quite vicious. There was also, and there continues to be, a very, very significant conflict in the Amhara region, which is ongoing. And so Ethiopia is trying to make a lot of inroads from claims that it has quite a lot of state capacity over its own territory. And these conflicts are contradicting those claims.
Hearing about Ethiopia, there was a civil war. The government kind of won the civil war. They needed outside help from Turkey and others. And that's an interesting connection for me, because people may ask, what role does Turkey have in Ethiopia, which wasn't even a part of the former Ottoman Empire? What are they even doing there? Explain to us, what are their interests there?
Turkey has interests in the Horn more broadly, and Turkey has been Erdogan in particular, has been quite a good friend to these struggling quasi-autocrats for quite a while now, in the sense that I think that he comes to them from a position of relative authority, and he says, listen, I can help you out, and in exchange, you can help Turkey out, whether it is having more control or relationships in its near or abroad, or better trading opportunities and relationships, or simply giving the impression that Turkey is a pretty main player within Africa, which it is. And that's been going on for about 15 years, I would say, that Turkey has made it very clear that this is going to be an area of its influence. And it's done it very successfully. I think that a number of different leaders can point to Turkey as being a useful and sympathetic ear when things go a bit wrong. In fact, of course, you may have seen that Erdogan was the one who brought together both the Somali and the Ethiopian leadership to talk about what was going to happen in Somaliland just last week.
And he's able to do these things diplomatically and militarily because he has the boldness and unity that Europe or the West may lack. In other words, in the Libyan case, they helped the GNA defeat Haftar, not because America or Italy didn't want the GNA to defeat Haftar, but because they weren't willing to deploy troops, train up people, send the drones, and the Turks were willing to do so. So presumably in Ethiopia, it's not that we couldn't broker a peace agreement or help one side win over another. It's that we simply don't deploy our forces, send the kit, right?
Yeah, in that case, it certainly was. It was also that there was a real perception that was not being helped by former administration people that the US, in fact, favored the TPLF and not the government.
Why would that be?
Why would they favor them? I think that there was a very, very close relationship between different administrations and the TPLF, which had been in power for 28 years. One of the reasons that the conflict started is because the TPLF did not want any sort of, let's say, role in the government that they did not control. 6 million people, so they were about 6% of the overall population, and they wanted full control of the government. And so that seemed totally normal for them to demand. And the US didn't call them out on it as forcefully as they should. And so Abiy got the impression over and over that the US would be kind of happy to see him gone.
Wow. Fascinating stuff. And it shows you the kind of missteps that come from the lack of coordination between different parts of, say, the US government. I'm sure that Samantha Power at USAID was doing one thing while people at the State Department and the regional bureaus want to do another thing, while DOD no doubt has its own interests. And these incoherence of our lack of coordination issues within the US government has increased with the rise of inward-looking Trumpism. And then the center left and the Democrats have not tried to right the ship with a real coherent approach and focus, because that would require breaking eggs and making omelets, and that's very tough.
I think that an awful lot of government representatives, potentially from the US, but from other places too, don't treat African leaders and let's say their counterparts as people with their own interests and agendas. And so they
Really?
not really. Like, they see them as, you're going to ask us for something and then we will give it to you in exchange for, let's say, good behavior, without understanding that they may not necessarily be governing the way you want. They may, in fact, be governing pretty poorly. But the alternatives within that country or their plans for the future of the state can, in fact, work out in a way that is not in line with what the US wants and is still positive for the country at large. And so the examples I'll give you again are those BRICS countries, or the countries that recently joined the BRICS from the continent, or Ethiopia, South Africa, and Egypt. Now, we can complain about governance across all of those countries in various ways, but the fact of the matter is that others, whether it be Turkey or Russia or China, are willing to see the possibilities rather than the limitations of those governments. And I think that it has led to far healthier and forward-looking relationships than the ones that we in the West now enjoy with those governments.
After the break, Cliona and I are going to talk about the Wagner Group as well as Sudan's civil war. Okay, we're back with Cliona on our Around Africa tour. I want us to get into some more thematic questions now. I mentioned that we are announcing our new partnership with the Royal United Service Institute, RUSI, and we're going to be featuring in the show notes 2 policy papers from them about Wagner Group and the Sudan civil war. So I want to ask you a question posed by one of these policy papers. Did the Wagner Group prove an effective tool for Russian policy in Africa? Did they achieve what they were wanting to achieve? And how has Putin gotten things that help him elsewhere via his Africa policy?
Well, it's of course unclear what he wanted, but if he wanted to do as Turkey did, which is to provide some assistance and much needed support for flailing African governments, he's done that to some degree. There has been a mighty backlash to it, though, that we didn't see with the Turkish assistance in the Horn. And in particular, in fact, just recently, Russian mercenaries who attacked truck drivers and I think bus drivers in Cameroon have been targeted by other truck drivers within that country to say, listen, this is enough. They're acting with total impunity. And so that's really what the African populations are reacting to most forcefully, is this notion that these governments have brought in Wagner. They've operated extremely violently. Their rate of killing civilians is far higher than any other armed group within the areas in which they contest. And that's particularly true in Cameroon and in Central African Republic. And yeah, it's not been taken well. So I think that however we look at this, it's been a relative failure. They haven't secured many governments, and they've instead really generated widespread condemnation. But I don't actually think Putin cares about that. So I'm not sure that's a loss either.
Concurring with your analysis, we are featuring this report from two RUSI scholars, Dr. Antonio Gustozzi and David Lewis, that I put the link to in the show notes. And they write, Russian policymakers seem to accept that Wagner's operations were a mixed bag. Yet they seem convinced that PMCs and mercenaries are here to stay, but that improvements, i.e. from a Russian perspective, are needed. Will it be possible to separate what was good for Russia and what was bad in the Wagner group?
Paramilitaries are here to stay. What we're seeing a lot within African countries, what we've seen, for several decades now, is that when the government lacks sufficient control, they will arm local militias. And those militias are supposed to contest these much larger, much more organized, often insurgent groups locally. And what ends up happening is that they, of course, do engage with these groups, but they also tend to start to coalesce and to organize themselves. And they eventually do become a threat to the government, if not kind of a sitting duck for these other violent insurgents. And so the paramilitary fixture is one to really think about as a symptom of disorder. When you are kind of outsourcing your security to these small, often community militias, it says something extremely serious about the ability of the state and state security services to provide even basic levels of security for their population. And it always, always comes back to them in negative ways.
This is exactly what Antonio and David are talking about in their report, which is the implications of the outsourcing of violence, that even Russia can't control what Redoute and the AfriCorps do. And as they get contained or attempt to restrain them more, the African clients want mercenaries that respond to their needs, not Moscow's. And this just kind of spreads disorder rather than achieving even the dictatorial ambitions of Russia or of the African clients. So pivoting away from Wagner Group in Russia, let's talk about Sudan's conflict. We're featuring a report from RUSI, Has Sudan's Conflict Reached a Turning Point?, written by Michael Jones. So I pose this question to you.
There's been several turning points. I hope that it has. I doubt that it has. Every time that the SAF or the Sudanese armed forces do well, there's this real hope that this is it. They've reached a turning point and they can really challenge the Rapid Support Forces, or the RSF, and their leader Hemeti. But Hemeti and the RSF are much more present and active in the places that the SAF has found almost impossible to overtake and engage with them. So that includes almost all of Darfur. It includes most of Kordofan. So as much as I think a lot of Sudanese would gladly take SAF at the moment, if they felt like they could hold off the RSF advancements, I think it's pretty clear that they can't. There is one element that might change that, which is that the UAE has promised to no longer send any reinforcements or support to the RSF. And without that, there's a hope that, of course, they'll be able to wither on the vine, I suppose. But that has yet to be seen. The RSF has a tremendous amount of material. They also have quite a lot of wealth because they themselves were mercenaries in Yemen and elsewhere for many
Libya.
years. And in Libya. And so they have deep coffers, which they will be able to rely upon, I think, to go forward.
I would like to come back to the top table question that we started this pod with, which is, so the second Trump term, how is Africa going to feature or not feature in that policy universe? And how will increasing tensions between America and China that are likely to come in the wake of tariffs going to play out in the African continent? Because, of course, China is a major consumer of Africa's resources, and they are able to play a significant role on the continent.
Yeah, one of the most important differences between China and the US when it comes to dealing with various African governments is that China has a no interference policy about political change, whereas the US has a all interference all the time policy about African governments. And what this means effectively is that China doesn't care who's in power as long as that person and their party can control territory and populations and keeps everything going and can produce a certain level of security, which means that the contests between the elites about who's going to be in power are likely going to get extremely vicious. They're going to likely be very, very frequent. And it's not going to be in the US interest to have relationships that are based solely on a particular individual being in power, because they're probably not going to actually have a long tenure in office. So what I would suggest is that we look at this as, what interest does the US have in Africa? It's actually very unclear, because they've made it as if it's either kind of an aid-dependent entity or they are too uncoordinated amongst themselves to actually extract some of the most important elements of potential trade with Africa, which would be often critical minerals and resources.
One of the attacks on the global center-left and center-right is that we don't seek our own advantage. In other words, the Democrats or Labor are too busy caring about human rights and women's rights to get at our own interests in a place like Africa, and that those interests might be things like critical minerals, but they might also be just stability and helping to get students from those places to have scholarships in our countries, because, there's a lot of skill and young people there, and will be useful to work with them. And I think that there is something to be said that the center-left globally, Biden and Starmer, don't have a coherent enough Africa policy.
I want to go back to something you mentioned before, which was that the left has let's say, a human rights-focused perspective. I would be more sympathetic to that perspective if I thought it was effective. It's both ineffective for the UK and the US, and it's ineffective for African countries and their citizens. The rise in conflict across the continent has been stark. During all of this time of development will bring security. So what we see is that there's never been more conflict on the continent in the last 20 years, and it's coming from all manner of threats. And development doesn't solve the security problems. It changes them pretty significantly, but it doesn't solve them. And representation certainly doesn't solve the security problems. So what we're seeing is that as African governments become more inclusive, which they are, we see a huge number of militias starting to come into play, because each of these politicians and these political interests start using violence to secure their authority and their power. So this development/human rights framing has been unbelievably ineffective at both of those things.
Wow, what a stark indictment of the global establishment. In other words, focusing on human rights has helped neither the West's interest in Africa nor the Africans themselves. I believe it because I've operated in this global enduring disorder, and I've seen it in Libya, where the more that we stress elections and rule of law, the more the Libyans have descended into a primordial state of chaos, corruption, and every semi-sovereign institution looting the Libyan wealth on behalf of their group. So what should we do?
Ooh, I mean, going from kind of a diagnosis to a prescription is tricky. But the first thing I think we have to do is to see and understand the politics of these countries as unique to their own. So understand these domestic political theaters as complex as our own, right? And we don't do that. I think that even when we were talking about Ethiopia, you're 100% correct that most people think about Ethiopia in these kind of ethnic bloc terms and not in terms of interests and competition and parties and layers of governance and opportunities and the use of violence and how disorder can be a tool for the promotion of interests and all the rest of it, which is what politics is. Instead, we think of these as very static, needy, aid-dependent entities, and they're not that. Some may be and some aren't. And so I think the first step for us is to understand what are the domestic politics that often push certain types of conflicts to evolve, like you were talking about before. And then what role do we want to play in this conflict? Do we want to see who wins? Or do we want to actually prevent the worst from occurring in terms of civilian tragedies? Or do we want to take a stronger stance? All of those can be possible, but at the moment, no one's doing any of those. And so the guardrails on some of the worst excesses have been removed, and that's why we're seeing these rises.
Very depressing. Cliona, would you order the disorder with me? I wish to ask you, if you were queen for a day and could create one international institution or one global policy that would help the international community's engagement with Africa, what institution or policy would you create?
I'll tell you what I'm worried about and how I would love to come up with a more innovative policy around it. I'm worried that some of these groups we've been speaking about and what we're seeing at the moment in Syria and Afghanistan is that these non-state groups, which are stronger than the state entities, are coming into power and they're establishing themselves. And they have various, let's say, vectors of extremism, but all of those vectors are affecting women and girls in a negative way. So if this were to happen in Somalia and al-Shabaab were to assume control, or if this were to happen in Mali and Jainim were to assume control, would we then be positioning African women and girls to kind of a prehistoric existence? And is there a way in which we can demand, first and foremost, that equal opportunities for women and girls within those contexts before any sort of international engagement occurs? That has to be let's say, the entry point to it.
This is interesting. So this harks back to what Marcy Sirks, Justin Trudeau's former chief of staff, said on the pod last month, which is that if she could suggest one international institution, it would be one which promotes more women in politics from the developing world. You are saying to kind of use it as a carrot and a stick, which is that if you wish to participate in our aid program or come to our international conference, you need to safeguard the position of, say, female education or women's participation. Otherwise, you can't get these aid dollars and you can't come to the conference.
You cannot. I mean, I think that the promotion of women within political spheres is very important. But a lot of girls out there are not going to become politicians and they still need to learn how to read. And so that's my biggest concern at the moment, how we can guarantee that those advancements are set in stone rather than something to be traded away.
How can we do this when we have so little leverage in these conflict zones? In other words, with the Chinese willing to step in and trade and the Russians willing to give mercenaries, when we turn our backs because you don't have enough female participation or not enough female education, couldn't we risk a further diminishing of Western leverage in a disordered Africa?
I don't think so, in part because I do think that, one, we need to work on that leverage, but two, it's not as if we have absolutely no role within the continent. And three, it's not as if we can't engage with Turkey or with China about these basic rules of excellent economic development, is making sure that your half the population, your women and girls, have basic healthcare, basic education, and of course the opportunities afforded to a prosperous country in a prosperous country. And so recently, actually, we were having this discussion amongst NGOs about China's work within conflict zones. And I said, well, does China have the equivalent of USAID, or how do its NGOs operate? And they didn't know. We say a lot of things about China, and I think that if we engaged a little bit more with our counterparts around what they would like to see in terms of development, we might get a lot further.
Well, that's more than enough from me. I could listen to Cliona's dulcet Celtic tones for hours more. As always, this show has been produced by the one, the only, the George McDonough. Our executive producer is Neil Fern. As I've mentioned, you really should subscribe to the Substack. It helps us order the disorder, and it presents all the links from the different articles. For example, we're going to have in this week's edition stuff from ACLED, Cliona's organization, about global conflict levels. But we're also featuring some outputs from Rusi about the Sudanese civil war and the Wagner Group. So please subscribe to the Substack via the link in the show notes, and become a paid member if you want to come to our March 11th event in Whitehall, as well as if you want to get some extra bonus audio. As always, I'm signing off by wishing you an orderly and Civil War-free week.